Robyn, would you like to kick us off with a welcome?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Robyn Eason. I'm the Long Range Planning and Sustainability Manager for the City of West Hollywood. And I just want to welcome everybody, not only to MGBCE, I'm sure you've been having an awesome day with all of the various presentations, but also just welcome you to our amazing session here tonight. The title of our session is Sustaining Cultural Legacies, is Climate Action and How Climate Planning Can Be Intersectional in Topics and Identities. And I've had the esteemed privilege of working with Bureau Happold, Pivotal Planning, and Inner and Outer Engagement, who will all introduce themselves in a minute on our Climate Action Plan update. So we're happy to tell our story today. All right, so these are the learning objectives. The first, understanding why centering cultural identities and legacies is necessary in climate work. The second is learning how actions that help communities thrive in place can be embedded into climate planning documents. Third is exploring various approaches to community engagement that lead with equity and reciprocity. And the fourth, to formulate new ideas on how to implement intersectional climate planning at the community and citywide scales. And I'll have the team introduce themselves.
Guess we can go left to right. My name is Rhie. I'm an associate principal in Bureau Happold's downtown Los Angeles office. I am an urban planner and energy manager by training and lead many of Bureau Happold's climate change consulting and sustainability consulting projects. Oh, it's the dreaded on mute.
There we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Rhie Simon. I have my own practice of community engagement facilitation and coaching through inner and outer engagement. Most of my community engagement work lies sort of at the nexus of environmental policy, worked on Los Angeles County Sustainability Plan, also with Bureau Happold, and excited to be working on and have been working on WeHo Climate Action with this amazing team. A lot of my work also is kind of at intersections of working with communities around death, dying, and grief, as well as queer identity and different kinds of intersectional identity approaches to policy issues. So really excited to share some of our work today. And just one thing I want to name is just a reminder that as we're presenting, throw your questions in the chat here in Zoom or in Hova is fine, and we'll have a little time for Q&A at the end.
And since I've already introduced myself, I'm going to pass the mic to Monique.
Hello, everyone. Monique Lopez with Pueblo Planning. Pueblo Planning is a participatory planning and design firm that intentionally engages with folks that could potentially be most impacted by any planning decision. Happy to be here with you all and looking forward to sharing and hearing from you all.
So I'm really excited to be presenting today because I think we have a really unique approach to climate action. This is something that I've been working on for about 12 years now professionally. And I like to look back every once in a while and like think about where we were in the era of uninconvenient truth. And do you all remember when Al Gore was like the face of the climate movement? It feels like so long ago. And this was like back in the day when President George Bush declined to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and cities and states for the very first time started stepping up. And that's part of the reason that I went into city planning and wanted to work on this this kind of work. And so this was, if you look at a lot of the initial climate action plans, they have a baseline year for greenhouse gas emissions around 2006, 2007, 2008. And that's because that's the first time that we, as municipal practitioners, were really gathering data comprehensively for the first time. Nobody had ever focused on climate change before. And so we were necessarily like obsessed with greenhouse gas emissions. And that was the starting point for planning. I worked in New York City, which under Mayor de Blasio had a very metrics-driven approach. So he had a phrase, you can only manage what you measure. And that was then. Now we fast forward to today, and Al Gore is no longer the face of the climate change movement. It is much more of a groundswell of advocacy, and that's made climate change a central priority for not only cities and states, but we see it now across communities, corporations, and other actors. I think part of this has also to elevate this quote on the bottom, right? Climate change is inherently unfair, and recognizing that frontline communities experience the impacts of climate change first and worst. This includes sea level rise, flooding, extreme heat, and other impacts affecting low wealth communities, both on a local scale here in the greater Los Angeles region, and then also on the global scale. And when we think about the economies that are being, and nations that are being most affected. So that it sets the stage, and I'm really excited about this team, and we were very intentional about this team together, and how we would do things a bit differently as we approach the update to West Hollywood's Climate Action Plan. So this is just a quick aside. This is from an unnamed climate action plan that I worked on back in 2011. And what you'll see here represented is that it was really focused on the greatest bang for the buck. This was the #1 prioritization criteria of saying, how can we take limited city dollars and get the most greenhouse gas emissions reductions? That meant early on energy efficiency. We sort of learned to double down on energy efficiency, and that we'd get the greatest bang for the buck by focusing on large buildings, commercial buildings. It was easier to do it there. You focus on one building owner who has a very large footprint, rather than many building owners who have many different priorities. And so you could get all of your greenhouse gas emissions reductions in one fell swoop. This had somewhat of an unintended consequence in that the public benefit and the public investment were all concentrated in commercial building owners and other sort of actors who already have a lot of resources and capacity. So I think that was an awakening, certainly for climate practitioners, and recognize that we needed to start doing things differently.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great intro. I'm going to talk a little bit about West Hollywood's context. And if you've listened to me speak about West Hollywood before, you know that I like to call us a tiny but mighty 1.9 square mile city in the heart of Los Angeles County, bordered by the west by the city of Beverly Hills and all other sides by the city of LA. We are a very urban, very walkable, very compact, very dense community made up of majority renters, with our predominant building stock being low to mid-rise multifamily properties built in the mid-20th century. We have always been rooted in the principles of social justice, incorporated in 1984, primarily to preserve affordable housing through strong rent stabilization policies, but to also safeguard access to services and equal rights protections for the LGBTQIA community. And since then, we've gone on to be a very strong voice for the undocumented, for women's reproductive rights, for arts and cultural access for all, and much more. We have a diversity of community types in West Hollywood that really allows and necessitates us to celebrate the dignity and humanity of all groups, which has been our intended approach with this climate effort, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And what I suspected before this project, and what I now know for sure, is that our longtime residents feel a sense of deep-rooted pride, identity, and connection to our city, with so many of them and so many others carrying unique stories of what draws them to West Hollywood at any given time, and also what keeps them in West Hollywood, throughout the years. And so we're really excited to share our process and our approach to how climate action planning can be intersectional in the upcoming slides. I'll hand it over to Rhie.
Thanks, Robyn. So Robyn already laid a little bit of context for this. And first, I'm going to talk a little bit about specifically what it meant for us engaging the LGBTQ community, and particularly queer and trans folks in West Hollywood. And so, as Robyn said, this matters, and this is really relevant to this project and important because creating policy pathways toward ensuring a healthy, sustainable future for queer people is central to the origin story of West Hollywood. You have this thriving gay and trans community that was finding a sense of relative safety in the area around West Hollywood, which was unincorporated LA County, particularly because it was outside of the city of Los Angeles, and that there was a long history and legacy and really traumatic actions of homophobic and transphobic policing and other things that were harming queer and trans people in Los Angeles. And so West Hollywood really got to be a safe haven. But then skyrocketing rent prices and a lack of rent control on the local level, then of course coincides with the start of the AIDS crisis. And so this brought out this just dire need for really thinking about what does it mean to take care of our communities at the intersection of health and housing and supportive resources, with identity in mind. That of course, this is something, health, housing, and supportive resources, something that everyone needs, and that there's this really uniquely pressing, dire need for the LGBTQ community, and especially those who were getting diagnosed with HIV, and coming together with the existing Russian immigrant community that had come to West Hollywood, as well as senior citizens who are living in West Hollywood. This is really sort of the origin story of how West Hollywood incorporated as its own city. And I think what feels really important to me in all of my, as well as Monique's engagement work here, that Monique will talk about in a little bit, is this idea that engaging communities about their future and about their ability to remain in place in the future is what engaging them around environmental issues is actually all about. So we'll touch on that a little more, but just wanted to share a couple of aspects of our engagement process and how we listened. Of course, pretty much this whole engagement process took place during the COVID pandemic era. So that's super unique, and would love to hear sort of some questions, and we can tease some things out just about that alone. That's like its own presentation at some level. And so one of the things we were going to do is actually create kind of a whole engagement pathway for LGBTQ leaders in West Hollywood. That was set to start in March. Of course, then COVID hits. We put a pause, really wanted to get mindful about how we were going to proceed, how we were going to meet people wherever they were at, in whatever capacity they had to be involved in this project. So we instead conducted a lot of one-on-one phone conversations, talking to all of West Hollywood's queer identifying advisory boards and commissions. Of course, it should come as no surprise that even amongst many of the other advisory boards and commissions in West Hollywood that are not specifically LGBTQ identified, they have people on them who are LGBTQ identifying. So it was just really amazing to hear, even from other commissions and ABs that technically didn't have to sort of do with identity, that needs for gay and queer and trans folks in West Hollywood just kept coming up. Thankfully, through some of Monique's work, they worked with the Los Angeles LGBT Center to distribute flyers and hear from clients and residents. We set up a phone hotline so people could actually just call in their feedback. And because actually we're now coming towards the final stage of our planning process here, in our final draft plan review that'll be in July, we're going to be looking to feature LGBTQ community storytellers who will get to sort of speak on behalf of their community and how they see this WeHo Climate Action Plan reflect the needs of people they identify in their community. So some things that we heard that feel sort of just unique to this intersection is that queer community in West Hollywood really expresses itself through small businesses and nonprofits. And so the ability for small businesses, whether it's and nonprofits, whether it's social service providers or gay bars or just trans inclusive businesses, is really understood as resilience. And there's a lot of concern that a lack of local housing affordability means West Hollywood will no longer be a safe haven for LGBTQ people, especially young people. And we know statistically that trans and queer youth face some of the highest rates of risk of becoming unhoused and being unhoused, and have really unique needs around mental health care. There's also, of course, a lot of trauma in this community around harassment and violence. And so it was really interesting to hear when we would just want to talk about transportation or the public realm, and maybe we were even sort of coming from a more mitigation approach around that. We were really hearing comments that were naming that whatever happens around transportation here needs to have a really unique sense of what public safety means. That West Hollywood, since it is small, can really act as almost more like a safe campus kind of feel. And that for the kind of public safety that is deployed here, that it needs to be trauma informed, but there needs to be a lot of care behind it. And that came up even when talking about things like cooling centers or resilience hubs, which, you know, more and more cities and sort of the environmental community is talking about. The last thing I wanted to note and what we heard that I think Monique will touch on too is, as Robyn said, West Hollywood is vast majority renter population, which is somewhat unique and also, of course, exists across the region. And what this really means is that there's a sense of inability to adopt the mitigation strategies that people might really want to do or wish they could do. They wish they could have sort of more green appliances or more energy efficient this, that, and the other. They wish they could redo their insulation or retrofit their home, but they don't feel like they have access to be able to do this. And so that's something we'll touch on a little bit as we move forward. Passing it on to Monique.
Thank you, Rhie. Our team took a targeted universalism approach, which comes out of the Center for Othering and Belonging out of UC Berkeley. And so what that means in the West Hollywood context is that there's a universal goal that we had in mind, and essentially ensuring that we co-developed a plan that provides strategies, policies, programmatic recommendations that not only mitigate the impacts of climate change, but also address those impacts and ensure that there is adaptive capacity. So that was a universal goal there, but also the targeted approach is really focusing in on individuals who could potentially be most impacted by ongoing climate change impacts, right? And so in the West Hollywood context, that was people of color, low wealth families, the LGBTQ community, unhoused, older adults, and those who English is not their primary language as well. And so to do that, we actually intentionally worked with community-based organizations and also city departments that had already existing relationships with those particular communities that are at high risk for the impacts of climate change. So here you see some images of some of the populations we engaged and some of the organizations that connected us with those populations. But for the bulk of my presentation today, I want to primarily focus on engagement we did with the local Tongva and non-Tongva Indigenous peoples. Next slide, right? So I want to first ground us both in people and place. So West Hollywood is located on unceded Tongva territory and situated between two Tongva villages. And a large portion of the land where West Hollywood is located once actually had freshwater marshes and wetlands filled with life. And the land was a significant site for ceremony, food, and really provided plants for shelter and transportation for the local Tongva community. So if we look here, the map that you're seeing to the right, really you get to see how West Hollywood is part of this larger basin that is connected all the way down to Santa Monica to the left of that. One thing that we wanted to be really mindful of in taking a targeted universalism approach is to be mindful of the generational impacts of climate change, but essentially that has been rooted in colonial violence. So we wanted to be mindful of the enduring history of colonial violence against Indigenous peoples that has created a lot of the climate change implications and that continue to impact Indigenous peoples as well. So with that, next slide, Ari. So with that, we partnered with an Indigenous-led organization located in the Los Angeles region, Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples, that really helped guide our process in engaging with the local Tongva and non-Tongva urban Indigenous peoples in bringing them into this process to engage in conversations around the impacts of climate change and also how that's connected to colonial violence as well. Before I get into what we did, I wanna share a little bit of how we did it and why. So really, a lot of our work really hinged upon relationships. So I had met Angela, who's the executive director of SPI, a number of years ago. We've been building that trusting relationship. But when I was invited to be part of the project team, engaged with Angela in a conversation about seeing how they would feel comfortable in being part of this process and how that would look like. And we wanted to build in also a respectful process throughout and a process based upon reciprocity. And how we built in both the respect and reciprocity is in terms of they helped inform and shape what our listening sessions look like. They helped inform and shape what the community survey, what was on it, how we asked the questions as well to make sure that we weren't asking questions that were potentially triggering for folks who would be taking them. And they were able to connect us with local Tongva individuals who were able to share their personal stories and thoughts around climate change and adaptation. And part of respect is also including them in the review and analysis of the report we're all co-developing as well. With reciprocity, we want to make sure that there is mutual benefit for not only the city and us as consultants involved, but also the individuals who are involved in that process as well. So we ensured that Sacred Places Institute was compensated for their time and expertise and the social capital they brought to the project, but also individuals who participated in the listening sessions, community survey, they were also compensated for their time. But reciprocity also means that they have an ability to also ensure that they're able to further provide input in how the plan is shaped. And the last point I want to focus on is on repair. And this is really key, which is deeply connected back to relationships. Indigenous peoples have been greatly harmed as a result of a legacy, an ongoing legacy of colonialism. And really, we wanted to use this project as an opportunity to start building relationships and repairing relationships between the local Indigenous communities and the city as well. And those conversations have begun, and the road to repair is starting as a result of the trust building that happened within this process. In terms of practice, and in the info session and listening session in particular, we asked, we didn't want to create a space of extraction, like let us hear what you have to say, but we also asked folks, what do you want to learn in the space as well? And brought in someone who is active in their own Indigenous community, who's Kauai, in doing climate action and adaptation planning there, where they were able to bring and share with the other local Indigenous peoples what they have learned in the process as well. So they were also learning from that space as well. We also, as I mentioned, engaged in this one-on-one storytelling where people could share in their own voice their stories and really center their voices, where we were able to curate that audio and provide that direct feedback in people's own voice back to the city and those who are making these decisions. Next slide, please. You know, while conventional approaches to the climate crisis planning really separates threats into discrete categories such as natural resources, health and wellness, infrastructure, and community. Indigenous planners, though, work within traditional systems. So we wanted to ensure in what we provided back to the city in terms of what we heard from the local Tongva and non-Tongva Indigenous peoples was situated within those traditional systems. And that's what you see here on the screen today. Really, the intention of this engagement process was not to engage in the practice of extraction of traditional ecological knowledge, but really instead to center the voices of both the Tongva and non-Tongva Indigenous peoples, to inspire and challenge us to build relationships, to work together, to repair harm, and collectively strengthen their, adaptive capacity. Indigenous people, can provide a lot in terms of their own traditional knowledge and how we can address issues such as climate change. And that could benefit the community widely, but we also wanted to make sure that they would also directly benefit directly from these things as well. And just quickly, I know that I'm probably at time, that I do want to highlight one of the things that's being integrated into the plan is particularly around Indigenous land stewardship. We learned from both the Tongva people, but also from the hazard, I guess the hazardous elements survey that Barrow Happel did around the hills and the importance of managed burning, the importance of wetland restoration and stormwater management, and the importance of transitioning park landscapes to both native and edible landscapes have come directly from the framing and what the Tongva people shared with us would be important to include in this as well. But also another key principle that the plan is now incorporating is the seventh generation principle, which really speaks to making sure that what is done today, how we keep in mind how that impacts 7 generations out as well.
Thank you, Monique. That's a perfect segue of that last point you were making. I think is sort of the okay, between both of our processes, we heard a lot. And then what does it look like to actually integrate that into climate action planning? Because, of course, I know we're both really mindful that one of the biggest disservices we could do is listen, get all this feedback, and then it's like, okay, well, sorry, that's not how this works. But actually to really make this, to make this reflect what we heard and what is necessary. So, thinking about intersectional approaches in a kind of cross-cutting topic sense is really where that comes up. And so just a couple of things, these are just a few examples, but things that, particularly in the listening processes that I engaged, that we heard a lot, already kind of mentioned, just housing affordability. We know this is the biggest crisis sort of plaguing our region right now. It's everywhere and it's really in our face, but West Hollywood is no exception, especially coupled with COVID, has just created a lot of fear around evictions and around who really gets to live here in the future. And again, if we're really thinking about what does it look like for this place to be sustainable in the future, then that entirely depends on who actually gets to enjoy that future here. Another thing, small businesses, again, as this centerpiece of community cohesion at the local scale. I mean, West Hollywood benefits from being a really walkable, dense place, but this is beyond just West Hollywood. This is really all over our region, that particularly unique identity communities, whether it's sexuality or gender or race or ethnicity or country of origin, find a sense of home in the small businesses that they go to. And so therefore, this has to be integrated into climate action and adaptation work. When talking about emergency preparedness, again, already touched on this a little bit about incorporating mental health and trauma-informed outreach and programs. And lastly, as really kind of Monique was just speaking to, and something I really heard, is that every time we tried to talk about green space, people really understood that. And I think COVID has a big reason why, but they're really thinking of it as a function of public space for recreation, for connecting in their community, for even sitting outside to eat, for going to a farmer's market, and even for cultivating the land and having land stewardship. Whether that happens through sort of a public garden, or their own home, but just that they're really kind of hearing that that's what green space means to them, rather than sort of merely this sort of place of biodiversity that's removed from the everyday lived experience.
All right. So now it's my turn, and as receiving all this amazing input through our engagement process, part of my job as the prime consultant and the technical climate action plan consultant is working with the team and figuring out how we're going to incorporate into the plan. And recognizing that housing affordability absolutely is a critical community priority, but we're not developing a housing element. This is a climate action and adaptation plan. And so what we chose to do was focus on these 4 themes, these thematic elements around social justice and the climate crisis. Like what is the intersection there? What is the intersection with housing security, public health, and food access? And the co-benefits, as it's stated here, are the non-greenhouse gas related benefits of climate actions. I'm not sure I love the co portion, but it is the terminology that's commonly used in this field. We do have to give credit to the Oakland Equitable Climate Action Plan. They came out with a framework last year that was absolutely terrific. That was very much along these lines that we drew inspiration from. So this is really intended to reflect community priorities and how we might view those intersections with climate planning. So just taking one example here on housing security, while what we can do through the climate action plan is think about energy and water efficiency retrofits and how to work with landlords to support measures that help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also maximize occupant comfort. In other words, like help people stay cool, particularly in the face of increased temperatures and more frequent and intense extreme heat events. Let's go to the next slide.
And so this is kind of this was all made possible by slide. Just one thing I wanted to sort of presence here as a takeaway is something that really matters to me, and I'll let Monique comment also if you want, is just about sequencing. And again, I can't stress enough that like how we adapted to COVID almost really feels like it deserves its own hour. But one sort of way to bring that forward here is just that even pre-COVID, we already were really thinking about how do we listen and when do we listen and why that matters. And so, this comes from sort of mostly my portion of the engagement process, which was sort of intended to be with more traditional power holding stakeholders. And Monique's portion of the engagement, which was sort of meant to really center those high-risk communities and those whose voices are often not included and not heard in these kinds of processes. But what's really been, I think, so interesting about working in West Hollywood is that there's a lot of meeting place of both of those, and where those come together. And I think that's actually probably really true in most communities if we're willing to see it that way. And so, when we were engaging, we were kind of making sure that we started the conversation with those communities that are of higher risk of being impacted by climate change. And letting that set the tone of then going to our internal city staff engagement with WeHo staff members and saying, this is what we're already hearing. And let's talk about that. And then taking it to sort of the more regional climate experts level of, this is what people in West Hollywood want to see happen. How do we achieve that? How do we integrate that? And so, yeah, and I think in some ways actually having to be really adaptable thanks to COVID almost, I don't want to say made this easier, but it just sort of got to really bring out, I think, the flexibility and the, again, just wanting to meet people at like how they can best engage and be connected to this process in ways that are less extractive than sort of your typical, maybe typical engagement can be, that meets them in their own time, and also is mindful of who's getting to speak first, and then how we set the tone with that. And Monique, was there anything you wanted to add here?
The only thing I wanted to add is that I didn't share in terms of the high risk populations, is that a lot of gratitude goes to Robyn in leveraging the relationship she already had with many of those organizations and internally with the different departments. And then also being willing to, with relationships that weren't there yet, being willing to reach out to those different community-based organizations and what have you. And so she was very, very instrumental in using her positionality in connecting us with those organizations who really helped shape what that engagement or that outreach was going to look like. And so again, it really comes back to relationships in order to do this really intentional work.
We've been in the weeds of this project for so long that it's kind of nice to hear us reflecting on our process and what we've done. I think I'm just a fan of the presentation, even though I've seen it before. So we wanted to wrap up this presentation by really reflecting on the impact, the resulting impact of all of this great work and thought leadership around this team and what that has meant for West Hollywood. And so overall, I think I would say that our approach really fed into our intentional and primary objective of developing a holistic, people-centered draft document with sub-actions that help us prioritize where investment should take place, where possibilities exist to apply a lot of the traditional ecological knowledge that we've learned from the Tongva and non-Tongva peoples into our climate practices moving forward, and really sort of reinforcing how our implementation strategies should really be mindful in serving community members of all types and with all lived experiences. Being committed to a people first and a people centered approach, like Monique said, really compelled the climate team at West Hollywood to reach out beyond the typical departments and the typical organizations that we engage with, to really understand where the frontline communities were, what some of the resources it is that they were needing, and how our project served as a nexus point for that kind of either engagement, reciprocity, or eventual the outcomes that will be part of this process. We were also able to capture really powerful stories from local Indigenous peoples, from frontline community members and beyond, and also really learn about the relationship to land from the Indigenous peoples and their cultural practices, and start to really understand how we can formulate a true partnership with the tribal community moving forward in a way that will really shape our approach and our process to how we approach our natural environment moving forward. And so that process will begin in earnest after the climate adoption. And then finally, I would say that this process really woke up our minds to the meaning of place for our community members. Ari did a good job of just explaining a lot of what we've heard from the community during this time. But, you know, I think the last 12 months, not being able to gather, not being able to appreciate places that I think we all take for granted, and public space in large part sometimes being invisible. You just sort of show up at your favorite bar, you show up at your favorite business, or you show up at your favorite, you know, part of town, and you patronize and you experience it and you walk it. And you don't really think too much of it because it's always sort of there. And the last 12 months, that was not the case. And what we were able to capture was the vulnerability of not having something that is always there, and how meaningful it is to people to have places that they can gather, and the multiple benefits that come from that, be it just social cohesion, be it stewardship, be it a place for mental and spiritual wellness, what have you. And so that's information that's really hard to capture, I think, in normal times, and just something that I thought was really special that we were able to get out of this process. And so I'm sure there's many other impacts that we'll also be thinking about moving forward as we go into plan adoption, but I wanted to highlight these to wrap us up. And I think that takes us into Q&A.
Yeah, thanks for that, Robyn. Yeah, I'm similarly, I'm in the fields. I'm like, oh, it's really special. There's one question, and it's actually, as I was thinking of possible questions, it's something I was thinking of too. So appreciating you, Kate. So Kate asks, you know, if you weren't working in a community where the city didn't support this level of commitment to social equity through this kind of fine-grained specific engagement process, how would you convince them to invest in this type of effort? Or sort of maybe, yeah, asked in like a similar, slightly different angle way. Maybe Robyn, you could just share a little bit more about what it's been like to sort of even work within the city, the, you know, different city staff and city departments on this, as hopefully I'm not blowing anybody's cover, but there's people who are really excited and receptive, and certainly probably people who this is not as exciting for, or have a lot of questions or head scratching or whatnot. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so, you know, I think West Hollywood is a little unique in that, you know, we have, we're a small city that's doing a lot of things and doing a lot of exciting things. And so I think the majority of our staff is really excited about climate action planning, which makes my job a lot easier, especially when we're engaging in this effort for the first time in 10 years. But you're right. I think there were definitely departments that weren't used to thinking about climate change as a nexus to their work. And, you know, I think this was a great opportunity to really start to have those conversations, because I would say that over the course of the, you know, 14 to 18 months we've been doing this now, we're now in sort of the draft document stages, and a lot of that original engagement, even though they weren't so sure in the beginning, they're starting to connect the dots now, you know, and I'm starting to get really great feedback on, you know, how we have been able to prioritize a lot of the communities that they serve, and they're able to also kind of be that mutual voice, or that surrogate voice outside of just my own, to support the work that we're doing, and also think about how it now can integrate into the work that they're doing, right? And so I think the ideal city would love to have cross-cutting documents that speak to all of the efforts, but also integrate the best of all those efforts into each other's documents. And while it's still going to take a while to realize that, I think this process has really sort of planted that seed. in a way that is, I guess, just innovative and in a way that we haven't seen before. It also does help too that we have some parallel projects going on as well. The housing element, we have a rail integration study for our Crenshaw North line going on at the same time as well. And then a lot of different moving parts with public safety and our MET teams and things like that. And so between COVID, between the racial uprisings, between all of that, it's really fed into this process where people are paying attention to how all of this is integrated.
I would love to add on here as well. Just from a consultant perspective, we do work at Bureau Happold with public sector agencies of all that are starting in many different places, right? And for our firm, climate action and equity are two of our three, core values. And we've been having discussions recently about how do we more systematically incorporate equity into all of our projects. And one thing that we have started outlining is identifying where clients are. And so there we have a baseline and are identifying the practices that we want to include in every single project, which can be as simple as providing compensation for folks who are participating in outreach and engagement activities. Then we have what we call emergent, which are clients who have expressed an interest in equity and inclusion. And then embedded would be sort of the furthest along the spectrum, and where I think West Hollywood is, where we really make it focal to the project itself. And Monique, I know Pueblo Planning has principles along these lines too, and we've had good conversation. And even before we decided to team on this project, sort of agreed what those would be.
And the only thing I want to add to what's already been said, I feel like Robyn's an incredibly humble person. And really the reason why we've been able to do the work that we collectively have been able to do is much in part because of the leadership she has shown at the city. And so that really, really makes a difference in the kind of work you're able to do and how deep you're able to do this work as well. So yeah, so just a lot of appreciation for Robyn.
Yeah, I'll second that. There's like a lot of fans in the room. Like claps are happening. Robyn is the best is going in the chat. I love it. The one other thing I'll say on this is that to all my sort of fellow engagement people, planners, etc. I think there's also, we have some responsibility too in sort of really helping to push the client, the government agent, to like do internal engagement. I love internal engagement. That's partially because I'm also like a veteran public sector worker, and felt like I was never really heard. It was my job to listen to others, which is totally fair. But there were places, there's all kinds of places that actually, internal staff is really passionate about and maybe willing even to sort of break the ice or take a chance to name in the government space that they might not otherwise without kind of that invitation and pushing and prodding. So I think it's also up to us to push for the ability to sort of engage internally as well as externally, and make that a place where honest conversation can really happen. So another question that came through is from Kevin, talking about how the pandemic has exacerbated our need for better understanding around health and wellness with respect to asthma and allergies. And so is indoor air quality a future focus point for our community? And just the one thing I want to say to that is something we didn't even name is alongside COVID and alongside racial uprisings for Black Lives Matter this past summer, last summer, this project also was happening, and our engagement was happening during the peak of wildfire season when air quality was really at its worst back in September 2020. So just to say that was also really happening. So it's a great question. Maybe Chris, do you want to take the lead?
Yeah, well, I like that the question was asked also at MGBCE, hosted by USGBCLA. And actually, one of the one of the reasons that LEED came to be was something called sick building syndrome, which was during the 1970s oil crisis that buildings had been sealed up so tightly in order to conserve energy that it produced actually poor indoor air quality. And that was one of the drivers behind LEED in the first place. And so I think this is something that where the green building industry and climate practitioners, we're continuing to learn more based on new sort of drivers and wildfire certainly is one that's very much top of mind for us now in Southern California, and what we've learned about maintaining a sanitary environment and one which doesn't expose folks to airborne particles, and how we balance that with with energy efficient design, with passive energy design. So it continues to evolve, and yes, I love the focus on it. It's supremely important. We have a lot of instances of asthma and other respiratory disease in LA more broadly. So it really, not only are we, but it has to be more of a focus moving forward.
I want to just add one thing to that it's not necessarily about indoor air quality, but something at the intersections as well that a lot of folks talked about, especially during this time, was about mental health and mental wellness, and the nexus between that and climate change, and the importance of ensuring that there are support systems and that for mental health and mental wellness as part of climate adaptive capacity. And so what has been really great about engaging folks in all these spaces is being able to see what is the nexus between someone's lived experience and how would we need to do things from a climate adaptive approach and a resilience approach that also integrates support systems for those types of things as well. So that's been really great to see elevated within the draft plan as well.
Thinking about sort of just indoor air quality and therefore just the safety of indoor space and needing sort of a safe, comfortable home. I'm thinking, Robyn, with like our last couple minutes left, one of the more sort of interesting things I remember happening through our process was sort of this thought from the city of West Hollywood about giving out air conditioners, and kind of the conversations that we had around it about resilience and if that's really the best approach. And I'm wondering if you maybe would just want to share like a tidbit and takeaway from that.
Yeah, that was a acute pandemic. When we got that first heat wave, I think it was like mid-April, and so we were all kind of dealing with the shelter in place orders, but then really trying to sort of fastly meet some community need around dealing with the heat wave and a 90-degree plus event for our community members that were at risk. And so one of the, I guess you could call it brute solutions, was to purchase fans and water as a way to mitigate anyone's discomfort during that experience. And, what I was finding as I was reaching out to other cities that were also maybe going through similar sort of surprise events was we were all trying to figure it out together. There was no right or wrong solution per se. But there are nuances to all of the approaches. And so one of the things that we learned during that time was that, fans can be, I guess, cooling mechanisms, but there's also a way that you can situate the fan within your unit in order to actually cool it and not just have hot air kind of circulating through the unit. And so in addition to delivering fans, we also needed to scramble to make sure we had the proper messaging around how community members were able to utilize those tools in order to keep cool during those events. And so those are good lessons learned, as we go into more of a resilience phase approach after plan adoption of how are we going to, deal with some of these extreme vulnerabilities moving forward, whether it be a health crisis or whether it be an extreme heat event.
in our last minute, any final words from us?
There is no wrong door to having a conversation about climate change and how we can address it in our communities.
Mm.
Well said, Chris. I think I just want to thank the team that's here today. It's been a joyous ride with them, unpredictable for sure, but I think our own team practiced resilience through all of this, in addition to thinking about resilience for the community of West Hollywood. So I just want to thank this incredible team on this panel. I couldn't have done it without you. And looking forward to finishing up this document and having a great roadmap for West Hollywood moving forward. And I also want to thank everybody who attended the session today. Thank you so much for listening.
I just want to say on behalf of the team here at USGBCLA, thank you to this panel. This was absolutely fantastic. And we hope to see everyone in the next few minutes back for our main session for our final awards of the day. So thank you all so much.